Okay, so we're diving into climate activism in the digital world today. And wow, this article you sent us is fascinating.
It really is.
It's by Mette Alstrup San Giovanni
Hmm.
and Nina Hall, and it's called Climate Activism in the Digital Age.
Right. From politics and governance.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really fascinating how they break down how technology is like completely changing the game for climate action.
Yeah, it's not just about, posting on social media anymore.
Right. It's way beyond that.
They talk about data and algorithms and like even satellite imagery.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah. So I guess let's just jump right in.
Sounds good.
One of the first things that really jumped out at me was how they talk about this surge in new climate movements.
Yeah, they argue that it's not just about like the number of groups increasing, but
Right.
like the whole way they're approaching activism is changing.
Like it's a fundamental shift.
Exactly. They give all these examples like Fridays for Future.
Oh, yeah, with those massive global climate strikes.
Exactly. And then you have groups like Last Generation and Just Stop Oil.
Who are known for being a lot more disruptive.
Yeah, they're really trying to grab attention, even if it means like blocking traffic or disrupting events.
And then there's this whole rise of climate litigation.
Right. Like it's a whole new battleground.
Like that group of senior women in Switzerland,
Hmm.
Klima Seniorinnen.
Taking their own government to court.
Yeah, over climate inaction. That's a powerful statement.
For sure, it really shows how activists are using the legal system to hold like everyone accountable.
Governments, corporations.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And what's really interesting is how technology is like a key factor in all of this.
Yeah, like they talk about 350.org and GetUp
Mm.
and how they use digital tools for so much more than just like raising awareness.
Right, they're doing sophisticated fundraising and really targeted campaigning.
It's like building a global movement at warp speed.
Exactly. But it's not just about speed.
Right.
The authors argue that technology is actually enabling totally new strategies for climate action.
So like what did you find most compelling about their arguments there?
Well, one thing that really stood out to me was the idea of decentralization.
Okay.
Like, technology is giving individuals the power to organize and act without needing those traditional, like, top-down structures.
Oh,
They
interesting.
use Fridays for Future as a prime example.
Makes sense.
Local chapters have a lot of autonomy, and they can tailor their actions to their specific context.
So it's more like a network than a traditional organization.
Yeah, exactly. And it makes you wonder if that kind of decentralized model is actually more resilient.
Like more adaptable than those traditional organizations.
Exactly, because it's not reliant on like one central leadership.
It's like the movement itself is mirroring the technology it's using.
Right, becoming more networked and fluid.
I like that. And that fluidity extends to how they use data.
Totally. The authors talk about this idea of analytic activism,
Okay.
where groups are using social media data to like test different messages and tailor their campaigns to specific audiences.
So they're kind of like borrowing tactics from marketing and political campaigns.
Exactly. But in this case, it's for, a good cause.
Right, for social good. But okay, that makes me wonder about how effective this approach really is.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that this kind of data-driven, micro-targeted activism actually leads to meaningful change?
That's a really good question, and I think it's something that the authors would say needs more research.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a risk of like superficial engagement.
Right, people just clicking, like, or sharing a post without actually doing anything.
Yeah, some people call it slacktivism, and it's something that activists need to be mindful of.
So it seems like technology can be a double-edged sword here.
Definitely.
On the one hand, it can amplify voices and connect people in ways we've never seen before.
But it can also create this disconnect between online engagement and offline action.
Yeah, like how do we bridge that gap
That's the challenge.
and translate those clicks and shares into actual real-world impact?
Right, and that's where the author's next argument gets really interesting. They talk about how technology is allowing activists to challenge that traditional information monopoly that governments and corporations have always held.
What do you mean?
Like, activists are using satellite imagery, drones, GIS, all these tools to gather their own evidence.
Of what?
Environmental damage emissions, even human rights abuses.
Wow, so they're like becoming their own investigative journalists,
In a way, yeah.
using technology to hold powerful actors accountable.
Exactly. And they give this great example of Global Witness.
Okay.
They used GIS and open data to expose the link between cattle farming and deforestation in the Amazon.
Wow.
It actually led to a successful lawsuit against a multinational beef chief traitor.
Wow, that's amazing.
It shows how technology can level the playing field and give a voice to those who are often marginalized.
So it's like shifting the power dynamics.
Right, and that raises a really interesting question.
What's that?
Do Ilstrup, Sangiovanni, and Hall see this as a threat to the status quo?
Like, are governments and corporations trying to push back against this increased transparency?
That's a great point, and it's something that they address directly in the next section of the article.
Okay, so we'll have to dive into that. But first, we need a break.
Sounds good. They argue that it's kind of like a digital arms race.
Wow.
And they say it's especially dangerous for indigenous and small island state activists.
Right, because they're often the ones on the front lines of climate change.
Exactly. They're defending their lands and livelihoods against these powerful interests.
And they're often more vulnerable to surveillance and repression.
Yeah, because they might not have the same resources or legal protections as like bigger organizations.
It's a scary thought that the same tools that can amplify voices can also be used to silence them.
It's a real challenge, and it brings up another concern that the authors talk about.
Disinformation.
Exactly.
It's kind of ironic that the platforms used to organize for climate action are also used to spread misinformation.
Yeah, it's like a battle for the narrative.
And the stakes are so high.
Because public opinion and political will are crucial for actually addressing climate change.
So how do we even begin to combat this tidal wave of disinformation?
The authors talk about the importance of media literacy and critical thinking.
Okay.
Like, we need to give people the skills to evaluate information sources and recognize bias.
So it's not just about debunking specific myths.
Right. It's about teaching people how to think critically about the information they see online.
So empowering individuals to be more discerning.
Exactly. And they also talk about the need for systemic solutions.
Like what kinds of things?
Well, they argue that we need to hold social media platforms accountable for the spread of this disinformation.
Okay.
They suggest things like regulations, stricter content moderation policies, more transparency about how algorithms work.
It's about recognizing that these platforms have a responsibility.
Yeah, they can't just ignore the harm that their technology enables.
Right. But speaking of responsibility, there's another important aspect here that we haven't touched on yet.
The digital divide.
Exactly.
Yeah. The authors argue that unequal access to technology can actually worsen existing inequalities.
And prevent those most affected by climate change from participating in online activism.
It's true, technology is not a neutral force.
Right. Its benefits are not evenly distributed.
And that raises some really important questions about equity and justice.
Like, how do we make sure that everyone's voices are heard?
Especially those who might be excluded from the digital sphere.
It's a tough question, but it's one we need to address.
Absolutely. The authors stressed that bridging this digital divide is crucial for building a truly inclusive climate movement.
So what do they suggest?
Well, they advocate for things like investing in digital infrastructure, especially in underserved communities,
Okay.
and creating programs that promote digital literacy and access to technology.
So it's not just about fairness.
Right. It's about making the movement stronger and more resilient.
Because everyone needs to be part of the solution.
Exactly. But there's also this inherent paradox that we can't ignore.
You're talking about the environmental impact of technology itself.
Yeah, the fact that the tools we're using to fight climate change are contributing to the problem.
It's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline.
Right. The authors call this tech's dirty secret,
Okay.
and they highlight the industry's huge environmental footprint.
Like what kinds of things?
The energy use of data centers, the reliance on rare earth minerals, the growing problem of e-waste.
It's a lot to consider.
It is. It's a reminder that technology always comes with costs.
So what do we do?
Well, the authors don't say we should abandon technology altogether,
Okay.
but they do call for a more critical approach,
Like what?
more sustainable practices within the tech industry.
Like using renewable energy to power data centers.
Exactly, and designing devices that last longer and are easier to recycle.
Right, because we need to minimize our impact.
And on an individual level, we can all be more mindful of our own digital consumption.
Like choosing refurbished devices.
Yeah.
Recycling old electronics.
And being more aware of our data usage.
Yeah. Little changes can add up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the authors also call for bigger systemic changes.
And moving towards a more sustainable model.
Right. It's about challenging those assumptions about technology and progress.
Yeah, it's a big conversation.
But it's one we need to have.
If we're serious about addressing both the climate crisis and the harms of technology.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I kind of want to shift gears a bit.
Okay.
We've talked about all these big systemic issues, but what does this all mean for, like, the average person?
Yeah, like what can our listeners actually do?
Exactly. because it can feel kind of overwhelming, right?
Totally. And the authors talk about that in their conclusion.
Right.
They emphasize the importance of mindful engagement.
What do they mean by that?
Well, they say it's easy to get caught up in the outrage cycle online.
Right. Always feeling like you need to be doing something.
Yeah. And they caution against that. They say it's important to be intentional with your time and energy.
Find ways to engage that feel authentic to you.
Exactly. And sustainable.
Yeah.
You don't want to burn yourself out.
Because that doesn't help anyone.
Right. It's about finding a balance that works for you.
Okay, so what are some ways people can engage?
Well, it could be anything, really.
Okay.
For some people, it might be focusing on local on-the-ground activism.
Like volunteering or organizing events?
Exactly. And for others, it might be using their digital skills to support organizations.
Like helping with social media or fundraising?
Right. The key is to find what aligns with your passions.
And your strengths.
And recognize that even small actions can make a difference.
Yeah, that's important to remember.
But as we think about how to engage, we also need to be aware of the potential pitfalls.
Like the disinformation we talked about.
Right. It's easy to fall into those traps online.
Yeah, like confirmation bias or getting swept up in emotional content.
And the authors really emphasize critical thinking.
Like double-checking sources, considering different perspectives.
Exactly. It's almost like we need to become digital detectives.
Carefully examining the evidence.
And not just taking everything at face value.
Right, because the internet is full of misinformation.
And it's constantly changing, too.
What do you mean?
Well, new platforms emerge, algorithms change.
Right.
We need to be adaptable and willing to learn new things.
It's a constant process.
Yeah, but through all of this, it's important not to lose sight of the human element.
What do you mean by that?
Well, even in this digital age, it's still about people.
Connecting with each other, collaborating, working towards a common goal.
Exactly. Technology can be a powerful tool.
But it's the people who drive change.
The ones with the passion, the vision, the determination to make a difference.
And that's really inspiring.
It is. It gives me hope.
You too.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great place to wrap things up.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, remember to be mindful, be critical, be adaptable, and most importantly, stay connected.
To each other and to this movement for a better future.
Because we're all in this together.
Absolutely.